Welcome all 100 of you and still climbing for the Alvin Weinberg tribute. We are so proud to have you here tonight. Of course, this is the 106th anniversary of Alvin Weinberg's birth. And we will continue to let people in as they come, and it's continuing to climb. We're up to 103. So we're really glad to have you here tonight. We're going to have a fun evening together. As you know, Ronnie has muted everyone so that you can better hear what's being said by presenters. We also want to use the chat function to capture questions you might have. At the end of our presentation, we will spend as much time as anyone would like answering questions. We're not going to pause as we're going through the presentation for questions, but if you have a particular question while a presentation's going on, if you'll just note that in some way in the chat so we can tie it back, we'll try to get that speaker to address your question at the end as well. We are fortunate to have some presentations that I think are just outstanding, and I know you're going to enjoy. We're going to start with Carolyn Krause giving a history of Alvin Weinberg at ORNL, and then we will have a video clip that talks about Alvin's character and leadership, and then Pat Postma will have a video, and then Bonnie Carroll, and then Ronnie Bogart will present to us. Both of those will present. Greg Marlin will have a presentation. And then Sid Ball will make a presentation, another video clip. And then our special guest tonight, Richard Weinberg, Alvin's son, will do the wrap-up presentation for us. So you're in for a treat. Just hang on, and here we go. Let's begin by Carolyn Krause. Now, Carolyn is a retired editor for ORNL Review, and she did that for a number of years. She's worked with me on Historically Speaking. I can't tell you how much I appreciate when she writes the story and I just have to introduce it and wrap it up. And she does a wonderful job there. So enjoy the presentation from Carolyn Krause about the early history of Weinberg at ORNL.
Thank you, Ray. Alvin Weinberg became director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory when he was 40 years old. For the most part, I'm going to zoom in on the first 40 years of his life. Next. Today, Alvin would be 106 years old. He died when he was 91. I attended his 90th birthday party in which he said, "Remember, the first 90 years are the hardest." He was the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. His father worked as a tailor and manager of a dress factory in Chicago, but he really wanted to be an engineer. Alvin was editor of his high school newspaper, following in the footsteps of his sister Faye. While growing up, he learned to play piano and tennis and kept up these skills all his life. He also kept up his writing skills. He wrote 8 books and 540 journal papers. This book is the source of the information for this presentation. He was a bold thinker and a popular speaker, and he coined new phrases to explain science and energy concepts to lay audiences. My favorites are burning the sea, burning the rocks, and technological fix. Next. At the University of Chicago, he majored in physics. In 1939, he earned a PhD in mathematical biophysics. To write his thesis, he mastered the mathematical theory of diffusion, which allowed him to calculate the travel distances of oxygen atoms in living cells. But for the Manhattan Project, he used the same theory to calculate the distances of free neutrons before they were absorbed by atomic nuclei. Neutrons, of course, are the byproducts and instigators of nuclear fission. Alvin's neutron calculations contributed to the design of the Chicago MetLab pile, the famous experiment led by Enrico Fermi on December 2nd, 1942, in which the world's first sustained nuclear chain reaction in uranium was achieved. Weinberg and Wigner were close friends and close work colleagues. They worked together extensively in Chicago and Oak Ridge during the 40s. Wigner designed the Hanford plutonium production reactors, but he got a lot of help from Alvin, who did many calculations. Alvin was most proud of the book that he co-authored with Wigner on nuclear chain reactors. The water-cooled uranium graphite reactors at Hanford produced plutonium in 1945, which was used in the second atom bomb that ended World War II. Weinberg believed the first atom bomb, fueled by uranium from Oak Ridge, was needed to end World War II, but not really the second one. Eugene Wigner credited Weinberg with designing the air-cooled X-10 uranium graphite pile in Oak Ridge because he did a lot of the calculations relative to where you put all the rods in the graphite block. The reactor staff proved plutonium could be produced from uranium and separated from it and fission products in spent reactor slugs. The staff contributed to the success of the Hanford project, and grams quantities of plutonium were sent to Los Alamos, which resulted in a bomb redesign. The graphite reactor became known as the world's first continuously operated nuclear reactor, and it produced radioisotopes for industry, agriculture, and medical treatments and diagnoses. Alvin was one of 18 members of the New Powell's Committee, which met in 1944 for a few months in Chicago. They explored designs for power reactors, including breeders of plutonium and uranium-233 fuel. They thought breeders would be needed because they were worried that our country would run out of uranium and thorium nuclear fuel. They also enjoyed discussing wild ideas like using nuclear energy to propel boats, cars, trains, and airplanes. Wigner came to Oak Ridge in 1946 as research director of Clinton National Laboratory. He established the first nuclear engineering school in the US. It became models for university courses. Alvin taught reactor theory at the school, which was first called the Clinch College of Nuclear Knowledge. And in 1950, the name was changed to the Oak Ridge School of Reactor Technology. Weinberg conceived and promoted the pressurized water reactor. He had worked with Wigner on water-cooled reactors, but he looked into the matter of pressurizing the water. He believed such a reactor using enriched uranium and pressurized water as a reactor coolant and neutron moderator could produce electricity. And he co-wrote a paper published in 1946 on the concept. Navy Captain Hyman Rickover, who attended the reactor school, wanted a nuclear submarine. And his idea was to use sodium as the coolant. But Weinberg suggested to a mutual acquaintance with Rickover that water would be a better reactor coolant for a submarine, and Rickover agreed to that. And as Weinberg put it, there's no liquid the Navy knows better than water. The Navy's first nuclear sub, the Nautilus, had a PWR launched in 1954. PWRs have been used for some time, actually, in submarines, aircraft carriers, and icebreakers. Rickover, wearing two hats, worked at the AEC for a while, and he pushed the use of PWRs in land-based power stations. Today, PWRs are the dominant reactor type in the 440 nuclear power plants in the world. So the Admiral was indirectly influenced by Weinberg. He oversaw the development of the first nuclear submarine that you see below, and the first US commercial nuclear power plant called the Shippingport, Pennsylvania Atomic Power Station, started up in 1957. Both were operating in the 50s and both used PWRs. New Year's Day in 1948 was a bad day in Oak Ridge. Weinberg and researchers were very disappointed in a recommendation by an AEC advisory committee that all reactor research and development be concentrated at Argonne under Walter Zinn. Clinton National Lab's mission was to be reduced to dealing with chemical waste, producing isotopes, and doing basic research. Some Oak Ridge researchers left for other labs, but Weinberg stayed. He was physics division director, and he began rising in management. And one of the first things he did was to save the lab. How did he rescue the lab and reactor programs? He went to Argonne to strike a gentleman's agreement with its director, Walter Zinn, according to the O&L review. Weinberg said Oak Ridge should could focus on developing research reactors and breeder reactors based on liquid fuels. He promised ORNL would not compete with Argonne in developing power reactors using solid fuels. Zinn agreed to it, and he got his managers in Washington to agree to it, and ORNL greatly benefited and eventually built 13 research reactors. The Air Force wanted a nuclear-powered bomber jet, just as the Navy wanted a nuclear submarine. In 1950, the AEC asked ORNL to be responsible for the nuclear phases of the new aircraft nuclear propulsion project. Weinberg did not believe nuclear aircraft were feasible. Like many people, he worried that such a plane could land and crash and spread radioactivity. But he did see the AMP project as a way for ORNL to return to its path of reactor development. So 2 years after being thrown out of reactor work, ORNL had 3 reactor projects. This was in 1950. The lab then built and operated a small aircraft reactor experiment that used liquid fuel, and that was for the AMP project. AMP work, and this led to the molten salt reactor development that was led by Alvin over the next few years. AMP work at ORNL also led to new high temperature corrosive resistant alloys, at least one of which is used today for aircraft turbine blades and in the chemical industry. Here's my summary of his legacy. As you read this or take photos of it, I want to add that Alvin also founded the ORNL Review Research Magazine in 1967. I was editor of this 54-year-old magazine for 25 years. On a chance encounter with him in a bookstore late in his life, I thanked him for creating the magazine and the job that I loved. That concludes my presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Carolyn. That was a great presentation. Yes, applause is appropriate either through a reaction or put your hands up in front of the screen because we're keeping you muted. You should know that as a historian for the city of Oak Ridge, I think that we have the epitome of a great scientist in Alvin Weinberg. And I think it is something that we as Oak Ridgers are very proud of, but it's not limited to just Oak Ridge. I'm proud to see in the chat that we have people from as far away as Arlington, Virginia, Ames, Iowa, and Calgary, Alberta. So we have a lot of people interested across the world in what we're doing tonight. Next coming up, we want to show you a video of Alvin's character and leadership. It's a clip from a 2015 video that was prepared. So let's watch that video now.
Dr. Weinberg